Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to see you all. Welcome from all corners of New York to this NYCP teach-in. My name is Lisa Marshall. I am the Director of Organizing and Advocacy at New Yorkers for Clean Power, and I'm so excited to share this teach-in with you today. We have three excellent speakers that are going to cover the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions in New York. They are Jaqi Cohen of Tri-State Transportation, Marguerite Wells, the Executive Director of Alliance for Clean Energy in New York, and Josh Berman, the Sierra Club Environment Law Program. We did have Janet Joseph, as formerly of NYSERDA, as a speaker, and Janet had some personal matters come up, and we're so grateful to Josh for subbing in at the very last minute for Janet. So really appreciate Josh especially, and all of you for being here, everybody with their busy schedules. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the topic for today, which is the state energy plan, the draft of which is now out for comment. And then our presenters are going to present on the transportation, power generation, and building sectors. And then we'll do some take action together, and we'll have the remaining time for Q&A. As we go along, please feel free to put questions into the chat, and our speakers will answer those at the end, or they may answer you in the chat. We would love to ask you, though, to refrain from having extended conversations in the chat while we're having our presentation. Please just put your questions. But it's very distracting to have back and forth dialogue. So if you'll just stick to your questions for our speakers, that would be terrific. And we're just delighted to see all of you. Please keep introducing yourselves in the chat, and let's get going. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of very, very abbreviated background and context for today's teach-in on the state energy plan. As most of you know, New York passed a climate law back in 2019 that set legally binding emissions and equity targets for our state. And this was a very exciting landmark piece of legislation that was many years in the making. And it's a little shocking to me to think that that was already 6, almost 7 years ago that we passed that law, if my math is correct. Then once the law was passed, the New York's Climate Action Council was convened with lots of working groups. And there, over a course of 3 years, with input from all kinds of subject matter experts and the public, the Climate Action Council created what's called the Scoping Plan, or Climate Action Plan. And this was basically a roadmap for achieving these climate mandates under the New York's law. And it was pretty exciting. It was finalized in 2022. Unfortunately, though, since then, very few of the recommendations in the Climate Action Scoping Plan have been carried out. And one, I'll mention just 2 of those that are very important, or maybe 3. One is that the plan called on the state to establish a cap and invest program that would collect funds from climate polluters to be used to invest in updating our clean energy infrastructure, and also in particular to go to disadvantaged communities. And that program has not been put into place. The second thing I'll mention is that we were expecting to see different targets for greenhouse gas emissions from different sectors, like how much can come from the gas system and how much can come from transportation. And until we have those sector specific recommendations, or limits rather, all of the planning that happens, each sector says, well, I don't know how much I'm responsible for, so therefore I'm not going to do anything. That's an oversimplification of the situation, but it's pretty bad. And the third thing I'll mention, and a lot of you probably worked on the New York Heat Act, is to change public service law to allow utilities to provide energy service to our homes that is not gas. Currently, the law says they have to provide gas. And that's a real barrier to our planning process to try to get off of gas in New York. So there's other recommendations, but I'll leave you with those 3 big ones that have not been carried out since this plan was finalized in 2022. And here we are, it's getting towards the end of 2025, and the state has a mandated process every few years to put out an energy plan. And the plan sets out the energy policy for the next 15 years. So in this case, to 2040. And it is binding on states agencies. So the DEC, the PEC, the PSC rather, and other agencies have to abide by what's in this energy plan. So this is a good thing, right? Because you'd think, okay, we can move these policies forward that meet our legally mandated um, greenhouse gas emissions under the climate law. But unfortunately, instead, the State Energy Planning Board has used the draft plan as a vehicle to ratchet back the state's climate ambitions. And they really want sort of to use this plan as a way to reset the table of what New York plans to do when it comes to energy and climate in the next 15 years. Obviously, all the groups represented on this call are very concerned about this, and we have some specific details and recommendations for each sector that we want to share with you, and we're going to have a way for all of you to take action at the end. So please stick around for the whole call, and then there'll be time for your questions. So without further ado, I want to turn this presentation over to my esteemed colleague and friend, Josh Berman. Thanks, Josh, so much for being here. And Josh is going to tell us what's in the energy plan for the buildings, which is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in New York, and what do we need to change. So take it away, Josh. Josh, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Thanks. Sorry, I didn't have the ability to unmute myself, but thank you for unmuting me.
1 second. Lorenzo, you have John, or somebody has John Berman spotlighted. We need to highlight Josh Berman.
I like that there are enough people on this teach-in that we have almost identical names. This is great.
Too many Bermans on the call. All right, here we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lisa, for the introduction. Thanks for letting me step in here. I'm filling in at the last moment for Janet on buildings, but am very passionate about this topic. So hopefully I can channel some of her energy and knowledge here and share some helpful information about buildings. So I'm Josh Berman. I'm an attorney with the law program at the Sierra Club. I have been working in New York State on a range of issues going back to 2011. So was around for the last state energy plan 10 years ago, which pioneered several important things, including increasing New York's renewable energy goals to 50%. Now we are well beyond that. Thanks. Yeah, so Sierra Club is the nation's oldest and largest grassroots environmental organization. We have chapters in every state in the country. Our chapter in New York is called our Atlantic chapter. We engage in grassroots activism, legislative advocacy, regulatory filings, and litigation on a range of environmental and climate issues. We can go to the next slide. And we have local groups throughout the state who are largely volunteer-led and do fantastic work. So yeah, we can go ahead. So let's jump right into building. So Lisa did a great job of teeing up the draft state energy plan, which I think with some of the kind of key themes, the buildings sector fully embodies the theme of lack of leadership. I think one of the things that's really frustrating right now is that in the face of real hostility federally, and with a climate law that expressly identifies leadership as being a core element, right? The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the draft state energy plan really fails to meet the moment, and it super fails to meet the moment on buildings. So as Lisa noted, buildings are the largest sector of largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in New York. They represent about 1/3 of the state's emissions. This is driven largely by the burning of methane gas for appliances and home heating. The draft state energy plan has some very, very big omissions in terms of addressing emissions from buildings, which I will talk about a couple. In particular, as Lisa flagged, the New York developed this very comprehensive and thoughtful scoping plan back in 2022. And I think many of us were looking to the draft state energy plan, partly because it is obligated by law to do so, but to reflect the specific strategies that were identified in the scoping plan. And some of the really key strategies for decarbonizing our buildings are missing from the draft scoping plan. One of those in particular is appliance emission standards. Um, where the draft scoping plan, the final scoping plan included very prescriptive ideas about when New York was going to phase out polluting appliances in our buildings. Those are completely missing from the draft state energy plan. The plan also, New York 5 years ago started a planning docket for how we were going to decarbonize the building sector. Many of us have been working for years on that, and then there's been about a dozen spin-off dockets. Instead of kind of ignoring all of the developments that have happened in those, the draft state energy plan basically says, hey, we need to develop a new strategic plan for decarbonizing buildings, and kind of jettisons all of the work that stakeholders have been doing to date. So, the kind of core recommendation at the highest level, I would say, on the building sector is that the final state energy plan has got to incorporate key omitted building sector strategies like these appliance emission standards, and it needs to articulate a clear vision for building sector decarbonization, including emission limits on gas delivered to buildings, which is what Lisa mentioned up front, and not defer those determinations to a future strategic plan or to individual utilities. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so just to kind of crystallize the lack of ambition, the draft state energy plan has multiple scenarios that it models. It models a business as usual scenario. It models what they call their core planning scenario, which is called additional action. Maybe euphemistically, it has a very, very modest amount of additional action beyond business as usual. And then they also model two net zero scenarios, which are basically the scenarios that the scoping plan was trying to put New York State on. And they, instead of actually following through on the recommendations that they would need to get to these net zero scenarios, they instead basically push forward with this additional action. So, I just kind of pulled one key quote on lack of ambition out here, which says full realization of Climate Act targets by 2050, as portrayed in the net zero scenarios, will require significant initial investment in market adoption for efficient electrification, backed by strong policy recommendations, such as new regulatory mandates, early retirement of existing fossil fuel equipment, as well as substantial technical progress. So the state knows what needs to happen in order to achieve the emission goals or emission mandates that are in the climate law, and yet the draft state energy plan simply is ignoring those. All right, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, another core policy that many folks, I'm sure, in this teaching have been deeply engaged in for a long time is the gas utility obligation to serve. So right now in New York, if you are a prospective gas customer and you're willing to pay the relevant interconnection costs, you are legally entitled to gas service. And that, there are many ways in which, obviously utility service generally is obviously like absolutely an essential, but the gas, whether you need to be serviced by gas, is no longer sort of an essential service. What you need is that you need, now there are very viable alternatives, electrification alternatives. And so we need to move beyond the current structure of the gas utility obligation to serve, because it is currently crippling our ability to cost effectively decarbonize buildings. And in particular, there's kind of two main reasons. One is that the gas utilities hide behind the gas utility obligation to serve in avoiding doing some of the things that we could use to start actually shrinking the gas system. And so there are things called non-pipe alternatives. So if you have utility is planning to invest, $10 million replacing a segment of pipe, and there are four people on that pipe. If one of those people says, I'd prefer to stay on the gas system, utility does not move forward with that project. Even no matter how much the person would be compensated otherwise for, electrifying their utilities. So, right now the gas utilities are hiding behind the gas utility obligation to serve as a way of not actually moving forward on much more cost-effective strategies like non-pipe alternatives. So yeah, thanks. Yeah. So let's go. Yeah, you can go on to there are a few bright spots in the buildings chapter. I flagged two in particular on the slide, and I would highlight one additional one. The draft state energy plan does prioritize support for energy upgrades for low and moderate income households. This is really critical to help ensure that these households are able to exit the gas system. As the system shrinks, if they are stuck on the system, they're going to see their utility bills increase. So very important that the state is providing funding to get those folks off of the gas system or on the early end. The the draft state energy plan is also very clear that we should not be blending hydrogen into our gas pipelines. This has been part of the gas utilities sort of keep our pipelines around forever and not shrink our system strategy, of saying they're going to decarbonize. And the big piece of that has been, let's blend a bunch of hydrogen into our gas pipelines. And the plan is actually like surprisingly clear that that is not a strategy that New York is going to pursue. One other thing that I omitted on this slide, but I think is also a nice bright spot in the buildings chapter, is that the plan recommends pursuing repairs and relining of pipes as opposed to full pipe replacement. Right now, gas utilities have thousands of miles of old pipes that they are planning to replace. It costs somewhere between $1 million and $10 million a mile to replace those pipes. So there is an expense sitting out there of tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. And repairs and relining cost a tiny fraction of that and can maintain the life of pipes for many decades. So if we are expecting the system to shrink, which we do, then it's much more cost effective in many cases to use repairs and relining. And then I'll close us out with one last slide and for transitioning over. Right, affordability of basic utilities is absolutely critical, but the draft state energy plan's passive and incremental approach to buildings is going to perpetuate wasteful spending and is ultimately going to increase overall costs for utility customers. The state needs to continue to fund critical programs such as Empower Plus, Energy Affordability Program, and expand newer programs like the Green Affordable Pre-Electrification or GAP funding to upgrade homes that would not otherwise qualify for energy efficiency measures. And New York can pay for these programs and investments by reining in unnecessary and unsustainable gas utility spending and including a funding mechanism such as New York Cap and Invest in the final state energy plan. And I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thanks so much, Lisa.
Great, Josh. Thank you. So that was a lot of information, but we're going to share the recording and the slides afterwards. And the key points of Josh's and everybody's presentation are summarized in the comment that we're going to let you share at the end. So next, we're going to turn to Jaqi Cohen. And next slide, please, for Jaqi of Tri-State Transportation.
Great.
Take it.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here with you all. I'm Jaqi Cohen. I'm the Director of Climate and Equity Policy at Tri-State Transportation Campaign. I've been working in environmental climate policy in New York State since 2011. I've been a transit advocate for nearly a decade now. I like to joke that my job is centered around complaining about the subway professionally, but as you'll learn, it goes a little bit beyond that. So we can go to the next slide. Great. So brief background on Tri-State. We are a regional advocacy organization serving New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. We are about 100 years younger than Sierra Club. We're, babies in the space, but for the past 30 plus years have been promoting sustainable, equitable transportation across the Tri-State region, with a real focus on expanding access to public transit, reducing car dependency, and decarbonizing the transportation sector as a whole. Okay, next slide. Also, apologies for the numbering of these slides. I don't know what happened there. So just to broad strokes, paint a picture of the current transportation landscape in New York. Transportation is unsurprisingly a major polluter. It accounts for 43% of fuel combustion emissions in New York State. New York State has an incredibly interesting transportation landscape, right? When you think of transportation, depending on what part of the state you live in New York, you might be thinking about driving or trucks, or you might be thinking of the subway or bus system in New York City. So we have a very multimodal, diverse landscape when it comes to our transportation. We have urban, suburban, and rural transportation systems. New York City in particular, the New York City region is home to a third of all public transit riders in New York State, or in the United States, sorry, which is massive. Many transit advocates would argue that the amount of federal funding that we receive is very disproportionately low, considering that we represent so many of the nation's public transit riders. And we have a massive freight network. We are a dense state. We have a high population. A lot of people live here, so a lot of people need goods to be provided here. So in addition to moving people, New York's transportation network is responsible for moving almost 1 billion tons of freight annually. Next slide. So before I even get into what's good in the plan, I want to note that what you're going to hear me talk about in this presentation, if there's one thing you take away from what I talk about today, is that there needs to be a two-pronged approach to decarbonizing the transportation sector in New York. One is, of course, through electrification and zero-emission vehicles, but the other is through reducing driving on the road. Those two things need to come hand in hand. I think often they get talked about separately in silos, which makes sense. You know, a lot of public transit advocates don't want to acknowledge that people in places do need to drive, right? But the landscape is diverse, so we need a diverse solution. Both things must be true. So when I talk about the need for public transit, that does not mean that we also don't need to electrify vehicles. That is as important. So within the plan, there are some good things that we support. There is a pretty strong commitment to transitioning vehicles to zero emissions, which is notable at a time where the federal administration is actively withdrawing California's right to enact higher than federal standards for emissions. So the state plan recommends funding for EV programs and incentives, including more build out of public charging infrastructure, both for low duty vehicles, cars, and medium and heavy duty vehicles like trucks and tractor trailers, and investment in existing market incentive programs. This is something really positive. We, of course, making it more affordable for people to buy electric vehicles until the point that we have parity with current vehicle costs is essential. Yes, thank you for the TOD note in the comments, and I'll get to TOD in a second. So this is important, and I think plays also into this narrative we're experiencing now of we need to be making things more affordable for New Yorkers, right? So making access to zero emission vehicles more affordable is critical, especially because the federal government is ending federal incentives, I think on September 30th for purchasing a zero emission vehicle. So we saw in the plan support for school district transition to electric school buses. The plan says New York State should work with school districts to complete individualized fleet electrification plans for every school district by the end of 2028. These plans will guide schools in the phase-in of electric school buses. And then third, as I noted, there's language in an entire chapter about smart growth, and transit-oriented development, which is taking advantage of the state's existing transportation infrastructure and building housing around it. We don't have nearly enough time. This could be its own workshop about transit-oriented development and creating density throughout the state. But this is a very easy way to, not easy, but a very clear-cut way to reduce the need for driving is by developing around existing transportation infrastructure. Next slide. So where the plan is lacking, both the draft state energy plan and the scoping plan for the CLCPA really don't go nearly far enough in describing what needs to be done to increase public transportation access. The plan acknowledges that there's critical importance of public transit for cycling, for pedestrian infrastructure to fighting climate change, but it's extremely weak on recommendations. It kind of just says, the state should encourage more bus ridership or more cycling or, work with localities. It really punts to localities to do it. There's no real vision for a robust statewide transportation plan. Our recommendations include one, stopping highway expansion projects. The state is currently investing billions of dollars in widening existing highway infrastructure. We think that money would be much better spent on things like public transit, cycling, and pedestrian infrastructure, especially because widening highways induces demand. It increases demand for those highways, increases driving on those roads. And we are recommending that the plan include a call to increase state operating aid to all transit agencies. Right now, the state invests $9 billion in STOA, in state transportation operating assistance. 8 billion of that goes to the MTA. There's a significant need for upstate and Long Island localities to receive more transit funding. Okay, next slide. Okay, VMT reduction. So this is sort of related to the first slide. The plan admits that driving increases can offset efficiency gains made by zero emission vehicle adoption. So, like I said before, the two must balance each other out. We need to have zero emission vehicles on the road, and there needs to be less driving. And if we're only electrifying vehicles without also reducing the need to drive, then the increase in driving zero emission vehicles can sort of undo its own stated purpose. So while it acknowledges that this is a problem, there's no binding targets to reduce vehicle miles traveled. VMT is a wonky term that we use to describe the amount of driving on the road in any given year. And like I mentioned, electric cars alone won't meet climate goals, just like public transit alone won't do it. We need both to happen together. So our recommendation has been for the state to adopt a 20% VMT reduction strategy by 2050. There's independent legislation that seeks to do that, the Get Around New York Act. But there needs to be a stringent target for the state to reach. States have adopted this, like Colorado, Minnesota. New York should adopt a similar strategy. But without that, there's not going to be the kind of reduced volume in car and truck traffic that we need to see. Next slide. And very notably, there's really no statewide freight strategy in the transportation part of the plan. The plan acknowledges that the transportation sector addresses freight delivery trends. Really what I think of is things like the e-commerce industry, which has proliferated in recent years, particularly since COVID, but it only accounts for decarbonization of this sector through sort of general support for transitioning fleets, not through an overarching statewide strategy. We are recommending that the state enact an indirect source rule for mega warehouses, similar to the southern coast of California, and create freight consolidation hubs, require urban freight electrification, incentivize cargo bikes and electric delivery vehicles, especially as last mile e-commerce delivery centers continue to expand and grow throughout the state. This is an industry that is way ahead of where we are in terms of regulation, and there really needs to be the foresight into reining in these emissions. There's a difference between going to the store to pick up your groceries and getting them delivered door to door to door. That has a real impact both on our streets, on congestion and traffic, and on air quality. And that's something that we need to see really addressed more firmly. And then I think I didn't include this in the last slide, but I want to mention that the plan also, it was interesting to hear Josh talk about the plan being sort of specific and not blending hydrogen into the pipeline for buildings, but the plan does leave a big door open for alternate fuels. And so we're calling for the state to not leave that door open. It says that, it plans to spread resources across natural gas, propane, biofuels, hydrogen. The plan does, it says, where electrification may not be appropriate, use these fuels instead. But that is like a very, very marginal case. And we don't want to see the state sort of like, appeasing the oil and gas industry by saying, okay, yes. And also, we'll incorporate use of these alternate fuels as well. They maintain fossil fuel infrastructure, delay true decarbonization. We have the technology available. It's working. Of course, it's, it continuing to evolve, but that's why we're not calling for an immediate phase in of these vehicles now. It's over the course of the next several years. And then I see a question, if I can just answer at the beginning, what is an indirect source rule? So because these warehouses are polluting through a mobile source, meaning the trucks, the cars that are making deliveries, there needs to be a rule that captures and understands the impact of those emissions on the environment, and then a plan to reduce emissions from cars and trucks. And so that is it for me. And then I can also take questions at the end, and I will pass it to Marguerite.
Thank you so much, Jaqi. Next slide. Next one again. So I'm Marguerite Wells. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance for Clean Energy New York. Before taking this role, I was a project developer in renewables in New York for 17 years. So this space is kind of my bread and butter. ACE New York is an advocacy organization. We have members who are renewable energy developers. We have members who are nonprofits, and then a bunch of folks in the support space around that. We advocate for clean energy statewide across all kinds of technologies, from EVs to large-scale wind and everything in between. We have a dozen folks on the team based in Albany. No, that's fine. Carry on. So big picture from my perspective on this, which echoes what's already been said before, is that the scoping plan, which enormous amounts of brain power and time were spent by people who really care about the topic to figure out how to build a roadmap that met the CLCPA law, has all been sort of put by the wayside in this draft energy plan that is much watered down compared to what the scoping plan really says. And yet, as I understand it anyway, the state energy plan is supposed to incorporate everything that the scoping plan has in it to some degree. And from what I have heard, the state believes that it has met the scoping plan and the CLCPA in this draft energy plan, which I do not agree with that assessment. So next slide. So I'm going to walk through a couple of different sectors that are in our scope: transmission, battery storage, and generation. So on the transmission side, I thought the draft energy plan was actually reasonable. It doesn't have a lot of meat on it, but it essentially says what the first bullet point says: we need a lot of collaboration on grid planning, and the coordinated grid planning process, which is an existing process that's going on, should continue. And we totally agree. It should continue. I think we believe that there can be, like the CGPP, which is what it gets called, can be improved, and we need to make sure that all the possibilities are being evaluated in improving the grid and where it gets improved, and what upgrades are proposed. I think there are a lot of cost-effective technologies that are out there that may or may not get included, but things like using what are modernized conductors, for example, and other kinds of power electronics that can help get us more service out of the grid we have, in addition to doing the larger scale upgrades that take a longer time to plan and cost a lot more. And we also agree with the state energy plan on the need for more interregional planning and collaboration. There's a proceeding coming out from FERC called Order 1920, which orders regions to plan regionally rather than utility by utility in terms of grid upgrades, and we are very much supporters of that. Next slide. On the electricity side, the scoping plan was very clear on this roadmap that we had to have 70% renewable energy by 2030, zero carbon by 2040. Draft plan basically echoes what the governor's been saying for a couple of years now. Well, maybe it's slipped to 2033, or maybe it's slipped to 2035. And there is nothing binding in the draft plan. And to unpack this a little bit, it's my view that when the scoping plan was laid out, when the CLCPA was passed, people recognized that it was an ambitious goal to have that much renewable on the grid by those dates, but it wasn't impossible, and it was certainly worth striving for. And one of the things that has happened in the past years since it was first enacted is that renewable energy has not been deployed nearly as fast as anyone hoped or expected. And I think as an industry, we have gotten a little bit of a black eye for that. I think the state does not necessarily recognize all the ways in which it has played an active role in confounding the ability of the industry to build projects. New York is second only to California in its difficulty to get anything built at all. And state processes are a very large part of that. Some of them have been actively fixed, and I'm a huge supporter of the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, for example, which was stood up 5 years ago or so to be a new process to issue permits for renewable energy projects, because the old process was broken. And I think it took a while for ORES, which is the acronym for that organization, took a while for ORES to get up to speed. It was very slow for a very long time. It was not an improvement over the prior process, but I think it is now an improvement. I think they have worked really hard to get a good process going, and I really want to laud them for that, because I no longer put onus on ORES to say you're really the stick in the mud here, because I don't think that they are. Another thing that was problematic for a very long time was the interconnection queue. and the fact that it took 5 to 7 years for a project to get through how to study connecting to the grid and get out the other side. So over the past 2 years, that process also has been significantly reformed. I think it's too soon to tell whether or not it'll be as fast as we might hope it to be and that it was designed to be. But I think so far early results are reasonable. I think one of the challenges with the current cluster study, it's called, is that because the entire interconnection queue had to sort of reboot and start again from square one, there's a huge bunch of projects in there right now, which is in and of itself a logistical challenge to get processed all together. But directionally, I think we've made a lot of improvements on interconnection. So although we haven't seen the wheels start spinning faster on that front yet, kicking out complete projects, I think we're well on our way. I think the third thing, which I still find very worrisome, the third thing that any large scale project needs is a contract for its renewable energy credits. And NYSERDA has been the clearinghouse for that for many years now. And in the Clean Energy Standard, which is a proceeding around NYSERDA's procurement, essentially, the ruling that came out earlier this year from the PSC was dishearteningly not aggressive. There were a lot of stakeholder comments making suggestions on how NYSERDA can improve its processes, including suggestions from NYSERDA themselves that were not taken up, and which means that the thing we got out of the Clean Energy Standard does not move the needle and does not solve the fundamental problems that procurement has had, because problems with the contracts and the fact that the contracts have fundamentally been inflexible and rigid from the beginning is part of why we have not gotten renewable energy deployed as fast as we would like it to. And so I'm hoping in the current, there is a current comment period outside of the state energy plan process on further ways to improve procurement. And I really hope that the commission takes a more proactive stance going forward and how to fix procurement in the state, because all of that feeds into how do we serve these milestones, and whether it's 2030 or whether it's 2033, if we're not building projects efficiently, we can't be serving the grid with clean energy. And I think all of that then feeds into a narrative which has informed everything that the draft energy plan says, which sort of assumes, well, we're just not going to get as much energy and it's not going to be as clean, and the heck with the CLCPA anyway. So sort of implicit in it and in some other sections, it's like, well, you know, the gas system's going to last longer than we thought, and we're probably not going to get as much offshore wind as we want and as much renewable energy as we want. So we'll just have to keep the fossil plants on longer. And rather than getting aggressive and saying, how do we not do that? How do we actually comply with the law? Acknowledging the delays we've had, how can we still double down and get more renewables deployed? That isn't really where the direction of this whole plan goes, sadly. Next slide. As mentioned by one of the earlier presenters, there's really a step backward on the Cap and Invest program. I think a lot of folks were hoping that Cap and Invest would be a really useful mechanism, both for reducing emissions and also providing a whole new funding source to reinvest in clean energy stuff and reinvest in disadvantaged communities. And the draft plan really doesn't talk about any recommendations for Cap and Invest or for carbon pricing or for reinvestment in disadvantaged communities. And I think it just misses a whole lot of what we hope to get out of the clean energy transition, both on the clean energy front and the improvements in disadvantaged communities. Next slide. For energy storage, this is another miss. So it's inherent in the increase of renewable energy on the grid that you need more energy storage, because as we all know, it's not always windy or sunny when we need it to be. Energy storage provides a buffer. Right now on the grid, there isn't enough renewable energy being generated to have extra electrons in the first place. Every electron that gets generated from a renewable source in the state of New York gets used instantaneously. And so the balancing of the grid right now is run by natural gas. It ramps up when demand ramps up. Natural gas ramps down when demand ramps down. Energy storage could be doing some of that ramping as well. And in the scoping plan, the goal of having 6 gigawatts of storage was very specific. Honestly, I think that's way too little. I think we probably need more like 30 or 50 gigawatts of storage. We need an enormous amount of it. But if we were to truly run the grid as renewably as we should to meet these targets, but nevertheless, the draft plan doesn't talk about it at all. It gives no specific targets, doesn't give a funding mechanism, doesn't say anything proactive about how to add more energy storage to the grid than we have now. There were many thousands of megawatts of energy storage in the interconnection queue right now. I don't have the number handy, but it's lots. So there's lots of private interest in bringing battery storage forward if there's a mechanism for it to participate in the market in a way that allows it to get built. So one of the things that we recommend is having a state level permitting process for utility scale energy storage. So anything 25 megawatts and larger. Reason we picked that size is that's the same size amount as every other kind of energy generation in the state. So whether it's wind or solar or a natural gas plant, if one were to get built, that's the size at which the state level permitting takes priority. The reason that the state has implemented state level permitting on all those other technologies is that it acknowledges that you need consistency in the permitting process, you need rigorous review, and you need to take it out of the local political fray and just have a project be evaluated on its technical merits. And energy storage right now has become a political football. And I think in order to get the storage built we need and give it the rigor and discipline in permit review that we need, I think it would be better served with a state level permitting process. Next slide. As mentioned again earlier, the scoping plan had a specific pathway to limiting greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide. That is just sort of ignored in the draft plan, in my view. There aren't interim targets. It has no teeth. It fundamentally treats greenhouse gas emissions as if they aren't part of the CLCPA and they are not something we need to be actively working towards. Next slide. So in closing, I think there are a lot of misses on what the CLCPA calls for versus what this draft plan says we should be doing. Much less commitment, much less specificity. One of the things that I think is challenging is that the draft plan appears to be written by a large committee of state employees across multiple agencies. And I think that doesn't engender any bold decisions. I think it's sort of death by committee, if you will, in the writing. And I think because the federal tenor has turned against renewable energy and more pro-fossil, I think the bulk of the employees who put this plan together probably just sort of picked up on the federal tenor and said, well, we don't need as much renewables and they won't be happening so fast anyway. And the governor herself has not always been as pro-renewable as she might in some of the messaging. And so I think this is our opportunity to try to reset that narrative and push for more clean energy than this plan is calling for, because I think people will, even though the plan is not legally binding, as I understand it, it is a written plan from the state of New York and people will point to it all over as reasons to not do hard things. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Marguerite, and to all of our wonderful speakers. We only do have 15 minutes left, but hopefully our speakers can stay a little longer because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. So I would like first to go to the take action, which is the next slide. And first invite you all to use our fresh off the presses letter comment tool, which is right here, to click on that and submit the comment that is written there. This comment is compiled by New Yorkers for Clean Power, the Sierra Club, ACE New York, and Tri-State Transportation gave us ideas, but they are not, we're not holding them responsible for being behind every recommendation or word of this comment. This is a New Yorkers for Clean Power comment, but we did get recommendations on the key points from those three organizations to help us formulate this comment, as well as the Renewable Heat Now campaign comments. And basically, the key recommendations you just heard from these three speakers are all included in this comment. So we would love for you to take comment. And while you're doing that, I just really want to say, why does it matter what New York does? We often hear from our opponents, we're just one state, right? Well, we know that that's a completely ridiculous argument. And let's just remind ourselves that New York, if it were a country, has the same size economy as the whole country of Canada or Italy. So, you know, what we do really matters. How outrageous would it be for Canada to say, we don't need an energy plan or a climate plan because we're, you know, just one country? That's the same thing that our opponents are saying New York doesn't need to do. So we know that's outrageous. And we are, you know, to be honest, we're falling behind other more progressive states in many of these areas, even though we passed the CLCPA, just because we have really been dragging our feet on the implementation. So, and why is that happening? Well, our state leadership believes that the political will for climate action is not there. And that's where we all come in, because they need to hear from thousands of New Yorkers about this plan. And that will be the only thing that can convince them. It's the content of these comments. They know all this, right? They have agencies that are experts in energy. They know that we need to do these things to meet our limits. They know that that the solutions are there. They know that we're falling behind in these various areas. They just don't believe that the political will among New Yorkers is there for a clean energy economy, that we understand the benefits, we understand what the investment is needed, and we understand that this is the path to a sustainable and healthier and better future. So we really need not only for you to make this comment today, but also for you to share this with everybody you know. You probably know 100 other New Yorkers that you could send this comment to via text from your phone or an email and ask them to make the comment too. We've made it as easy as possible for you to make this comment. All right, next thing. This state energy draft plan is out for official comment until October 6th, and there are hearings. Some of the hearings already took place, but today there's a hearing in Poughkeepsie. Tomorrow there's a hearing in Brooklyn, and Thursday during the day there's a hearing in the Bronx, and next week there's a hearing in Long Island. And I hear you all saying, well, I can't make it to those hearings. What should I do? Guess what? There's also an online hearing. It's not the most fun to sign on to a Zoom or a WebEx for hours and make your 2-minute comment, but imagine the reaction of our state officials if we had so many people sign up that instead of for a 2-hour period, we kept them on the line for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours with our comments demanding these investments in clean energy. So let's make that happen. And the links to sign up are in the chat. Another way is through the media. LTEs and op-eds are important ways to reach politicos and their staffers. I don't think actually people read them anymore, but we know that the governor's staff does and the state agency staff know about them. And we actually are having Renewable Heat Now is hosting our monthly power hour Thursday evening at 7. Where we're going to have a training from the Sierra Club's letter to the editor writing team on how you can write and submit a letter to the editor. So come to that training. If you've never submitted a letter to the editor before, I can tell you from personal experience, it's a great ego boost when your letter gets published, and then you can share it out with other people. All right, so I don't want to keep talking because I do want to leave some time for questions. And if your question doesn't get answered during the meeting, we apologize, and we will try to follow up and get an answer for your question. But let's, all the links are in the chat for these action steps. I will add one more thing. There is a movement afoot to ask the state to extend the comment period. We don't know how that will go, but if you personally or your organization wants to ask for that, you could add that to the online comment, or you could send something to the Energy Planning Board about that. Let's unshare the slides so we can all see each other, and we'll go to some of these questions. All right, so let's see here. I know that Anshul asked a great question to Marguerite about bonding large-scale renewable projects to lower costs to ratepayers, and whether Marguerite has thoughts about that. I'm not getting the exact wording of Anshul's question. Let me find the Q&A document. Marguerite, did you see that question?
I didn't. I'm looking in the chat for it.
somewhere I have a document with these questions in it, but I can't find it, of course, at the moment. I'm looking for it now. But Anshul, do you want to re-ask the question? Oh, it says,
here it is. Just found it. California just passed legislation to allow bond funding for large transmission projects to take some burden off ratepayers. What are your thoughts on a similar strategy in New York State? I don't know enough about it to speak intelligently, but just based on what's written there, I would guess that it's certainly worth exploring, because at the end of the day, transmission projects aren't sexy. Nobody wants to pay for them on their own bill, but we all benefit from them because we all need them. And even in a world in which every rooftop solar megawatt could be installed on every building we've got, it still isn't as much energy as we as a society consume. So we still need transmission. We still need large scale plants. And so finding different ways to pay for it and different mechanisms is always good, because there's going to be some blend of things that makes it go.
thanks, Marguerite. I have a question from Carol, and I will just say, I live 2 hours from the nearest passenger train, 2 hours drive. So Carol's question is near and dear to my heart as well. There used to be a train that went by my house or close to here every day to New York City and to Buffalo, but it doesn't exist anymore. And even Biden's rail plan didn't include bringing it back. So Carol says all the old train rights of way in the Finger Lakes region, which is where I also live, have been turned into lovely bike and walking trails, and the tracks have been removed. What are the pros and cons of maybe turning some of them back into trains? So
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, it's sort of a case by case basis, in my opinion, based on like the existing, like the quality of the infrastructure. Something that we're seeing that's really exciting is the advancement of the IBX in Brooklyn and Queens. I live in Queens, so I'm very excited about a potentially easier trip to get to Brooklyn. And that is using underutilized freight rail, that right of way, because of course, building new rail is incredibly expensive, and the most expensive piece of it is the real estate procurement of it, right? And so it sort of depends. I mean, it's always important if the state has the right of way to build rail and there's already, a set path. It's something, I think we've also all been promised high-speed rail now for decades. If you go on state DOT's website, it's still on their homepage from 2009, their statewide high-speed rail plan. Nothing has happened with it. I hope to see it in my lifetime. I think in the interim, we need to be more focused on buses, which is, talk about not sexy. Like everybody loves to talk about the new innovation in transportation and high-speed rail, but I see we have Carol on a bus, which is it looks like, or maybe a train. It might be a train. But on a bus, great. Buses move more people more efficiently than any car could, right? And we have vastly underfunded bus systems across the state. Even in New York City, we have the largest bus network in America, and it's it's one of the slowest. We need to invest in more frequent service, because that is but bus ridership has hemorrhaged riders since years before the start of the pandemic. We're starting to see a rebound to pre-COVID times, but even then, that is a low bar. And the thing that gets butts and seats is not just affordable fares, but also frequent service. People need to know that when they show up to the bus stop, they're not going to be waiting on the side of a highway for 45 minutes for the bus to show up. So those kind of investments reduce the need for cars, reduce the need, because it's the most efficient way to transport people. And that's something that the state can really invest in right now. But of course, it's not as sexy as, some of the newer, like self-driving cars, for example, right? So we could have a whole separate conversation about that. But I think in terms of, taking back previously in use rail, I think it sort of needs to be examined as part of a statewide rail plan.
thanks so much, Jaqi. All right, lots of comments. I reposting all the links that you need because I don't want them to get buried in the chat. Jean asks, what provisions are there in the plan for large-scale geothermal and thermal energy networks? Josh, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So Yeah, there's a little bit in the plan on that. It's not super prescriptive, as Jean probably knows as much as anyone about this topic. I mean, again, like my take on the buildings chapter is that it is, and right, those sort of recommendations are split up among several different chapters of the plan, and they all kind of articulate slightly different visions and recommendations. And so it's a little bit hard to distill. That's why I kind of pulled out a couple of the more specific and concrete things that are actually in the plan, like the no hydrogen blending into the gas system. So, there is some material on that topic, Gene, but to me, it's not like part of a really crisp and clear vision of how we get to where we need to get with the building sector. So I think one of the themes of comments for folks who are inclined to comment on the building sector is like, we need this plan to articulate a vision that makes sense. And that can't be the vision that the gas utilities are promoting, which is going to be the most expensive and regressive possible way of getting any progress in the building sector. So, I think absolutely there is a role for thermal energy networks and large scale geothermal. And we've got some folks on this call who are extremely, I see Bill and other, there are a lot of very knowledgeable people on this call who can speak more to this. But I think like, we ourselves are going to need to push for the state to articulate a clear vision, and we should identify elements like that should be key pieces of that vision.
Thanks, Josh. I'll just add that, these thermal energy networks are a big investment, a big upfront cost, but they're incredibly beneficial, not only to the buildings that they serve, but also to balancing the whole grid and the need to meet, grid demand. So the benefits of these networks are really long lasting, and they're sort of the best way to scale neighborhood electrification for buildings. Josh Wilson asks, is there a template or anything?
Marguerite also has her hand up, Lisa.
Yeah, I was just going to add on the end of that I think it's telling, if you look at the structure of the plan itself, there is a chapter about electricity, and then there is a chapter about nuclear, as if nuclear doesn't generate electricity. Obviously, they felt it so important that they decided to give it its own chapter that isn't anything else. And to Josh's point, other technologies like geothermal and TENS are not organized into any subheading anywhere in the plan that I could find. They're just sort of mentioned along the way as afterthoughts. And so I think if nuclear deserves its own heading, then perhaps other technologies that have good value to add could merit at least a subheading somewhere.
And some of those that we could be building right now. Okay, so Josh Wilson asks, is there a template or a letter to work for from municipalities? I actually have a sign-on letter for municipal elected officials to sign on to that's just about 2 items, not about the whole plan, but any of our speakers have an answer for how municipalities can get involved in the state energy planning process?
I don't know, outside of participating like we all will.
I will just say, if you participate as a speaker or write a comment, it will really be important to say if you're representing municipality. We do know that politically, the governor does care a lot about what local elected officials and municipalities think, especially if we have a diversity of them. So please participate and identify yourself when you're speaking at the hearings. Again, if you haven't spoken at one of these hearings before, we have some great, or even if you have, we have some tips for crafting your 2-minute comment, which you might want to look at, and the link to that we can repost in the chat. And please do submit your comment. I'm wondering how many we have submitted so far. Lorenzo, if you can tell us in the chat, that would be great. Gabe, can you put your comment in the chat, please? Yes, Delia's right. I know they do that for Assembly and Senate. If a senator or a state assembly person comes to the hearing, they put them first, no matter when they arrived. I don't know if they'll do that for city council or town board member, but it's worth trying. You might get in and out quite quickly and be able to speak first. So that would be helpful. So we've got over 100 people. We had 125 people at least on this call. We've had 30 people submit comments. So, and it is after 1 o'clock. So I'm just going to probably wrap up our Q&A now. Thanks so much to all of our wonderful speakers and to all of you who attended. I'm going to leave the comment link again and ask everybody to promise to submit. And if you've submitted a comment on the plan before, you can submit another one. You can submit a comment, as many comments as you want. And we really encourage you to do that.